Homer locates the Iliad and the Trojan War toward the end of the Mycenaean Age. The Mycenaean Age was about 1500 to about 1150 BCE, and it was named after the largest and wealthiest and most powerful city on the mainland, ruled, according to Homer, at the time by a king named Agamemnon. According to the Greeks themselves, the Trojan War was a 10-year siege that was fought by a consolidated army that was made up of contingents from all of the mainland citadels and some of the island citadels, which were all called together by Agamemnon, and they sailed a 1,000 armada of black ships against what Homer generally considers to be another Mycenaean city, Troy. It was fought in the completely developed version of the story because Paris or Alexandros, who was the son of King Priam of Troy, abducted Helen, the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta. King Menelaus of Sparta happened to be the brother of King Agamemnon, and Agamemnon and Menelaus were deeply insulted at this violation of hospitality laws. And so that it was Agamemnon who called together this armada of 1,000 black ships to sail to Troy to avenge the insult and to bring Helen back. Homer's Iliad doesn't tell the entire story of the Trojan War. It deals really only with about 52 days that take place in the last year, the 10th year of the war. And its arc is a sort of internal, much smaller arc. It begins with the wrath of Achilles. It begins when Achilles gets angry, and it ends 52 days later when the wrath of Achilles subsides. And so the poem is really about, the first line says, "Help me sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, the anger of Achilles." And so it covers only about 52 days in the 10th year of the war. When the poem ends, Troy is still standing. Troy has not fallen. The fall of Troy is assumed. Everyone would have known the story, but it ends sometime after the poem ends. The poem was kept alive for about 400 years from the time of the events that occurred in the Trojan War until the time it was written down, were kept alive for about 400 years by the oral tradition. Presumably, it was kept alive by bards who sang songs after dinner at aristocratic houses. We will meet two of those bards in Homer's Odyssey, so we can see there how they worked. But the idea was for about 400 years, these stories had just been circulating until someone, whom the Greeks called Homer, gathered some of them together and wove them into a single grand narrative, doing for the stories of the Trojan War perhaps what Sinleki Unini had done for a whole lot of different stories about Gilgamesh. The distance between the events and the time of the telling shows up in some interesting kinds of ways. The tradition, the oral tradition that Homer is working with, had the Greeks, the Achaeans, if I call them Greeks, I mean Achaeans, that's what they're really called in the poem. Homer had the Achaeans fighting in chariots, but during the 400 years of the Dark Ages, the Greeks had lost the ability to fight in chariots. They didn't use chariots in fighting anymore. So he has these chariots, but he doesn't know how they're used. He doesn't quite know how to use them. And so what he does is in the Iliad, he uses them as taxis. The great heroes get in the chariots in the morning, they ride out to the field of battle, then they get out of their chariots and they fight hand to hand on foot. There are other little anomalies like this that show up that show some of the distance between Homer and when he's working and when the events took place. Homer defined what an epic was going to be, and from here on out, every epic that we look at will be like Homer's because it is influenced by Homer's, it is shaped by Homer's. And so it perhaps would be a good idea to just mention a few of the conventions that were established by Homer and thus became mandatory for all epics that are written later. Because the events happened a very long time ago, Homer assumes that people in those days were bigger and stronger than we are. So that his people are larger than life. They're huge. Somehow the human race has deteriorated in the 400 years between then and now, and humans were bigger then. He tells at one point, he tells about Aias, who's the second greatest warrior in the Achaean army, picking up a rock, and he says the rock is so big that 6 men, the way men are now, couldn't lift that rock, to give some sort of sense of scale. So, one, people are larger than they are now. He also understands that in the past, gods and goddesses participated more directly and more frequently in human life than they do now. That makes life more transparent. It's easier to see what life is about and how it works if the gods and goddesses are there making decisions and doing things. And so the gods and goddesses are so present in the Iliad and Odyssey that they became mandatory for every epic that follows. Everybody who writes an epic is going to have to put gods and goddesses in them. By the 18th century in a kind of flippant way called this the supernatural machinery of the epic. So every epic has to have supernatural machinery in it. The epic style, as Homer defined it, is a lofty style. It avoids vulgarity, it avoids colloquialism, and even its rhetorical devices are always on a very, very grand scale. One of the devices which became mandatory for all later writers was the epic simile. It's a comparison which is introduced by like or as, but which can run on for many, many lines. Sometimes, in fact, as you're reading, you get the feeling that he's forgotten what it is that he's comparing to what. He's gotten so interested in simply this comparison in describing what he's talking about. There's a really very famous one that happens in Book 8. This is one night the Trojans have pushed the Achaeans back up against their own ships, and they're so sure about victory that they don't even go back inside their city walls that night. They camp out on the plains, and from the bulwarks that the Achaeans have thrown up around their ships, they can look out over the plain and see all of these campfires burning out in the plain. And then Homer makes a beautiful simile which goes like this. And so the Trojan spirits soared as they took positions down the passageways of battle all night long, and the watchfires blazed among them. Hundreds strong as stars in the night sky glittering round the moon's brilliance blaze in all their glory when the air falls to a sudden windless calm. All the lookout peaks stand out, and the jutting cliffs and the steep ravines, and down from high heavens bursts the boundless bright air, and all the stars shine clear, and the shepherd's heart exults. So many fires burned between the ships and the Xanthus whirling rapids, set by the men of Troy bright against their walls. 1,000 fires were burning there on the plain, and beside each fire sat 50 fighting men poised in the leaping blaze, and, champing oats and glistening barley, stationed by their chariots, stallions waited for dawn to mount her glowing throne. That's a very famous epic simile, and you realize that what happens is Homer gets so carried away with the idea of the shepherd on a hill looking out and seeing all these beautiful stars that for a moment we almost forget that he's describing a bunch of bonfires out on the plain. The poem also begins, Homer begins his poem with an invocation to the muse. Homer wasn't there himself, so he doesn't know the details of this story, so he asks the muse to help him remember. The convention here is that an epic poem is not written by a poet, but the poet is just the vehicle through whom the muse sings. And therefore, an epic poem is never personal. It's never about the poet. It's the poet simply recites what the muse tells him to. And that's why in 27,000 lines in the Iliad and Odyssey, there's not a single detail about the poet. Not a single detail, which is one of the reasons why we know so little about him. The poem isn't about him, it's about the story. The epic also begins, after Homer, it begins in medias res, that is, in the middle of things. Homer begins in the middle or toward the end of the story, and then he fills in all the necessary background for us in flashbacks. Homer's subject in this first poem anyway was war, and that likewise became very crucial, so that future epics will mostly be about military heroes, heroes on the battlefield and the honor that they can win there. The poem itself begins with a dispute between Agamemnon, the great king, and Achilles, who's the greatest fighter of the Achaeans, over a slave girl. And that's what leads to the anger of Achilles, which is the announced theme of the poem. The reason why a slave girl can matter so much is that the Greeks lived in what anthropologists and sociologists sometimes call a shame culture, which, to oversimplify it, is a culture in which one's own worth is based on how one is valued by one's peers. A warrior's worth, therefore, is based on the prizes that are awarded him after each battle by the army, a little perhaps like a game ball in football, in which the players decide that one person who was most instrumental in winning this game gets the ball for the day. These prizes pile up, so after every battle, whoever's most instrumental gets more prizes than anyone else, so the more prizes you have, the more value you are. So when Agamemnon strips Achilles of one of his prizes, a slave girl. Achilles loses face in front of the entire army. And Agamemnon, who is the leader of this troop, considers that he would lose face by backing down to Achilles. Agamemnon has lost his slave girl through a set of circumstances that aren't really his fault, but he feels that he would lose face if he has less prizes than he deserves, and so he takes one from Achilles. And Achilles now is stripped of his honor in front of the entire army. He can't back down. Agamemnon can't back down. And so what Achilles finally decides to do is he's just going to go back to his tent and not fight anymore. He's going to sit out. And he hopes the Achaeans lose while he's sitting out. This sounds, this is overly simplistic. I'm explaining it in overly simple terms. But it's perhaps easier to remember if we think the modern army still works in some ways in the same way. What your status is depends on how many stripes you have and how many epaulets and how many medals. And to have those stripes stripped off in front of the army is still a way to lose a lot of face, and people will treat you differently afterwards. Maybe even a clearer example would be professional athletics. The way a quarterback knows how valuable he is how much he makes. If he makes less than other quarterbacks, his peers, whom he thinks are not any better than he is, what he wants then is he wants a compensation which is equal to theirs, so that he will then regain his face in the eyes of his peers. And so what he does is, if his owners or management won't pay him that, then he will do exactly what Achilles does. That's he'll sit out. And he hopes his team loses while he's sitting out until they know how valuable he is and how much he's worth. The whole action of the poem starts from this confrontation between Achilles and Agamemnon. And because Achilles is, like Gilgamesh, is half divine, his mother is a goddess, his father is mortal, he asks his mother if she will make sure that Zeus helps the Trojans win against the Achaeans as long as he sits out, which she does, and which Zeus does. And in a way, this in part simply validates what's going to happen, because if with Achilles out, the Achaeans are not going to do very well anyway. But what this does is it also engages the gods and goddesses in the action of the poem. With Achilles out of action, the Trojans gradually begin to win. Slowly, day by day, they push the Achaeans back across the plains. And then finally, when they're getting their backs up against their own ships, they throw up some earth bulwarks to protect their ships. When the Trojans actually breach those bulwarks and set some of the ships on fire, Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend, asks whether he can put on Achilles' armor and go out that day and at least drive the Trojans back away from the bulwarks. Achilles says yes, but just long enough, just drive them away from the bulwarks. As soon as they're gone, then you come back. And Patroclus agrees to this. Now he puts on Achilles' armor, and of course Achilles' armor is very noticeable, and for a brief moment it's a great help because the Trojans think, whoa, Achilles is back in the fight again. But after the Trojans begin to retreat, Patroclus gets carried away by a sort of battle frenzy that day, and he can't stop. He just keeps driving them back and back and back until he has the Trojans pinned up against their own walls, and there he fights and dies, killed by Hector, who's the greatest Trojan warrior, as Achilles is the greatest Achaean warrior. Achilles, up until this time, has been angry primarily at Agamemnon. Now he redirects that anger. It goes up a notch or two, and he redirects his anger at the Trojans and at Hector. He has a perfunctory reconciliation with Agamemnon. Agamemnon loads him up with gifts. He doesn't care about that. He goes out to fight, and it's a nightmare day of fighting. He skewers people. He just kills them at random. He doesn't observe any of the rules of fighting. He just kills and kills and kills. And it's a horrible, horrible nightmare day for both sides. And finally, at the end of the day, he meets Hector, whom he's been looking for all day. He's been fighting his way through the Trojan ranks to find his way to Hector. He does find his way to Hector, and then he kills him. And after he kills him, his anger still isn't over. So he ties Hector's body to the back of his chariot, and then 3 times drags it around the city walls in front of Hector's wife and his infant son and his mother and his father and all the people who know that Hector was their defense now that he's gone. How terrible this is going to be. Achilles drags Hector's body back to the camp, and he still won't allow it to be buried. He has a great burial service for Patroclus, his friend, but every morning he still drags the body around the grave of Patroclus, and then he drags it one more time around the city walls so the Trojans will see this. The anger of Achilles ends when Priam, the old man, the father of Hector, king of Troy, makes his way out alone to Achilles' tent to beg the return of his son's body. Achilles wakes up and he looks down, and there is this old man, this grand old man, the man who was king of the most magnificent city in the world, weeping, holding his hands, kissing the hands that had actually killed his son, and begging for his son back. And Achilles looks down at this old man, and what goes through his mind is he thinks of his own father back home waiting for a son who will never come home again, and Achilles begins to cry as well. Achilles weeps for his own father, and he weeps for Patroclus, and Priam weeps for Hector, and he weeps for Troy, and both of them weep for what it is to be human. And at the end of it, Achilles takes the body of Hector and carries it himself out to Priam's wagon, and then with the end of Achilles' anger, the poem ends too. The very last event in the poem is the funeral of Hector in Troy. Well, that's just a kind of quick overview of the entire story. There are so many things that this poem bequeathed to later literature that we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about them. But let me just pick out two that I think are really, really important, not only in the rest of the history of literature for our course coming up. The first is the idea of heroism that comes from this poem. This is a war poem, and in this poem, heroism is defined in terms of fighting hand-to-hand in battle. Two great warriors, armed equally with the same skills, meet, they exchange genealogies, and then they fight. It's been compared in some ways to the great gunfight that happens at the end of a Western, in which two heroes face off against one another. What invariably happens in Homer is that one of them walks away covered in glory and the other one dies, because it's a zero-sum game. In order to win glory, in order to win honor, you have to win it from somebody. In this poem, you have to win it from somebody else. And it's one of the reasons why you exchange genealogies, because you don't win glory fighting an inferior man. So they always exchange genealogies to make sure they're worth the fight, make sure that you're worth killing. And then these two men, without magic tricks, without any kind of trickery, simply square off, and one of them goes away covered in glory, the other one loses his life. And if we ask why heroes are willing to fight for glory, for honor, to risk their lives like this, when life is so short anyway. Life lasts such a short time, so why would you risk it doing something like this? Their answer is, as it would have been for Gilgamesh, I think, is that they fight for glory because life is so short. Because it's so short, you want something that's going to outlive me. You're going to want something that's going to last after I'm gone, the way Gilgamesh finally settles on the walls of Uruk as his legacy. And there's a wonderful passage that happens in this poem when a Trojan named Sarpedon is about to charge the walls, the bulwarks that the Achaeans have thrown up around their ships. And he says this to his friend Glaucus. He says, "Ah, my friend, if you and I could escape this fray and live forever, never a trace of age, immortal, I would never fight on the front lines again or command you to the field where men win fame. But now, as it is, the fates of death await us, thousands poised to strike, and not a man alive can flee them or escape, so in we go for attack. Give our enemy glory or win it for ourselves." And so that's why you do it. You do it because life is so short, because you have such a short time to win this kind of honor, to win this kind of glory. Achilles illustrates this perfectly. Achilles is not only the protagonist of the poem, he's also the greatest fighter, and he illustrates this point perfectly in Book 9. Agamemnon has sent an embassy to Achilles begging him to come back into the fight. And what Achilles says to the embassy is, he said, "I don't have anything personal against the Trojans. They've never done anything to me. And in fact, the only people who do have something personal against the Trojans are Menelaus and Agamemnon." He said, "I am here only for a chance to win glory for myself and to leave behind a glorious name." And then he says, because his mother is a goddess, his mother has told him that he has two possible fates. He can either stay home and live a long, anonymous, happy life, or he can go to Troy and he can die very young but leave behind a great name. And he is here at Troy. So his two fates, in some kind of way, he knows he's going to die at Troy. He made the choice and came here anyway. But that's in fact the sort of fate that awaits almost everyone who came to Troy, because although they don't know they're going to die at Troy, they have to risk their lives for glory every single day instead of staying home comfortably where they could have, because they can say with Achilles, I don't have anything against the Trojans. They never stole my wife. And Hector, who's the greatest of the Trojan warriors, actually can illustrate this same point. In Book 6, he comes home and has an interview with his wife, Andromache. And what his wife says is, she says, look, don't go back out to the field, because every day you go back out to the field, you run the risk of getting killed. And one of these days, it's really going to happen. And when it happens, she reminds him, Achilles has killed my father. He's killed my brothers. He gave my mother into slavery. So he said, you are my family now. You are everything I have. And if something happens to you, you know what's going to happen to me. Your son is going to be killed. I will be given into slavery. Your parents will be killed. Your city will be leveled. All that. So don't go out to fight. Fight a defensive war. Stay here. Guard the walls. And you know that the city will never be taken if you fight a defensive battle. And Hector listens to her and he says, I understand. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I agree with your strategy. I agree with everything you say. But, he says, all this weighs on my mind too, dear woman. But I would die of shame to face the men of Troy and the Trojan women trailing their long robes if I would shrink from battle now, a coward. Nor does the Spirit urge me on that way. I've learned it all too well. To stand up bravely, always to fight in the front ranks of Trojan soldiers, winning my father great glory, glory for myself. And so what Hector says is, I know what's going to happen to you. And he says, the only thing that makes it easier to take is I know that by the time my son is killed, by the time you're given off into slavery, I will be dead and I won't be here to see it. And that's in fact pretty much what does happen to Hector in the poem. He does stay outside the walls when the rest of Achilles has driven the rest of the Trojans inside the walls, and he stands out there and he thinks, what should I do? If I went in, if I go inside, I could be safe, but do I dare go inside? Would I lose too much face by going inside? And then he says, I would die of shame to face the men of Troy and the Trojan women trailing their long robes. So now, better for me to stand up to Achilles, kill him, come home alive, or die at his hands in glory out before the walls. And of course, that's what happened. He is killed by Achilles out before the walls, and everything that his wife prophesied is going to happen. What it suggests here is that the first duty of a Greek hero is to his reputation to oneself. Family considerations, community considerations come second and third, because the first and primary duty is one that you owe to yourself. And this idea has had a very, very long run in Western history. In the classic American film High Noon, when Marshall Kane and Amy are in the buckboard leaving town, and he turns the buckboard around, he says, they're making me run and nobody's ever made me run before. And he goes back to meet the Frank Miller gang, even though he knows by going back, Amy has said she will leave him if he goes back. The community doesn't want him to go back. He goes back, he makes the same choice Hector does. That is, he chooses his own dignity, his own self-esteem, his own integrity over that of his family and over that of his community. Moses Hadas, in a book called The Greek Ideal and Its Survival, comments on this really stunning aspect of Greek heroism. He says, the most striking single feature of the Homeric ethos is the enormous importance attached to individual prowess, individual pride, individual reputation. Heroes of other epics prize their individuality also, but in none is the drive for self-assertion so ruthless and pride so paramount as in Homer. In Roman or Christian or Indian epic, it is a function of heroism to submit individuality, however grandiose, to a higher sanction. The Homeric hero may not compromise loyalty to his own being with loyalty to any other, human or divine. And that's a powerful way to say it, but that really is true. That is the ideal of Greek heroism. That's powerfully stated, but it isn't any more powerful than this Greek individualist conception of heroism really is. The second enduring legacy, one that is equally important, I think, especially for the history of literature, is Homer's treatment of the enemy, the Trojans, as equal in dignity and humanity to the army of Agamemnon and Achilles. As Homer has them, the Trojans speak the same language, they worship the same gods, they live by the same codes. It may even be that for most of us, the Trojans are even slightly more sympathetic than the Achaeans, because we get to see the Trojans at home with wives, with mothers, with children, with parents, while the Achaeans are simply an army on the prowl. The only women in the Achaean camp are slave women. My students, when I teach this in class, almost always wind up liking Hector better than they like Achilles, in part because you get to see aspects of Hector's humanity that we don't get to see of Achilles. And the reason why this is so important is if we think back to some of the stories about the wars that are told in the Tanakh or in the Old Testament, what we get there is the fact that the enemies are treated as pretty reprehensible people, because an enemy of the people is also an enemy of Yahweh. Here, what we get Homer treating these Trojans as equal in dignity and humanity. We care about them by the time the poem was done as much as we do about the Achaeans, and that is a great step forward. Northrop Frye, in his Anatomy of Criticism, says it very beautifully when he says this about the importance of this detail in this poem. It is hardly possible to overestimate the importance for Western literature of the Iliad's demonstration that the fall of an enemy no less than that of a friend or leader is tragic and not comic. With the Iliad, once for all, an objective and disinterested element enters into the poet's vision of human life. Without this element, poetry is merely instrumental to various social aims, to propaganda, to amusement, to devotion, to instruction.